Oh, God. Let me pull up the chair to the old microphone here, Steve.
Yeah, we're sounding as old as we are, I guess.
I guess so. Gather around the old chin wagon, the old...
The mind is youthful, but the body is...
That's exactly it. What is it? The body, the mind is willing, but the body is not. What is it? That's that old saw.
Yes, the flesh is... No, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Is that the...
I think that's right. Something like that.
Augustine or something?
Is that what it is? It's something like that. Here we are, Steve. Gathering around the virtual campfire. Nice to see you. I'm Paul Giamatti, by the way. Hello.
I'm Stephen Asma. Welcome to the Chinwag.
Stephen Ozma. Stephen what is it? The Axle Man? Is that what I'm told your name means?
Yes.
Is that right?
My name in Fries apparently means Axleman. So Steve Axleman, you can call me.
Steve Axleman. I like it. In Fries, not many people get to say that in Fries.
Yeah.
Which is the language of Frisia?
Friesland, yes. North of, I went there actually not too long ago, and it was pretty cool because I went to the capital, Leeuwarden, this is north of like Amsterdam and what everybody else thinks of as the Netherlands. And it used to be an independent little country. Mm-hmm. And I went to the place where my great-great-great-grandfather lived and then took a ship over to the States, and came to the United States in the 1890s.
Huh.
I guess
is there any kind of Frisian independence movement? Is there a kind of bunch of them wanting to break off and
apparently there is. I don't know enough about it, but they are a surly bunch who
are they?
They're really surly. They're like, no, the Romans never conquered us, and they
awesome.
Say we fought the Nazis harder than the regular,
awesome.
Dutch.
Awesome. So they're like the Scottish or something.
Yeah,
they're the kind of we don't fuck around. Everybody else is a pussy. And wow, that's amazing.
That's
excellent.
Yeah.
I hope there is a movement like that. Free up the Frisians. That's amazing.
The Frisians. Let my people go.
Let my people go. All those kinds of I kind of hope that the Scottish, they break away.
They're trying. They're trying every few years.
Every few years? I was so disappointed when they didn't that first time a while ago. I was like, come on. It'd be so great for the Scottish to just lead the world into peace and love and enlightenment.
That's not the Scottish
No,
background.
it is. That's where all the enlightenment comes
David
from.
Hume and that's true in Edinburgh maybe.
Yeah.
But not the Highlands.
Oh, I don't know. I think that's a mischaracterization of the Scottish. Who is it in Catalonia too? Isn't that the sort of southern Spain and then I guess the Basques too used to have.
You're quite the rebel, Paul.
I'm interested in these rebellious.
Underdogs.
Yes, I'm interested in these places sort of breaking off and becoming, independent and sort of, seeing what that would be like. I guess. I don't know. Am I really in favor of that? I don't know that I'm actually in favor of that.
You like the spirit of it,
yes.
And so do I. But then there's the economics of it.
There's the economics, and there's a lot of the things that tie to it that I'm not so sure, actually. Now that I think about it, I don't know. I'm of two minds, Steve, which is actually what a lot of what we're going to talk about today is
two
about.
Hearts beat within your breast.
Exactly. Today we're actually going to be talking a lot about sort of not knowing the answer one way or the other.
Yes. The phrase I like that I've seen the Forteans use, which I really love, is we're talking about inexplicabilia. Shit that cannot be explained. I love that word, inexplicabilia.
Yes, indeed, because we are going to be talking to a gentleman who is a bigwig at the Fortean Times, which is a magazine that I have read for a while, and you have read occasionly, Steve. I believe.
You turned me on to it. When we started talking several years ago, you were like, "You check out this guy Charles Fort," and we're going to explain this in the episode. But I read the books. I got really into it. It's awesome.
Yeah, he's super interesting. But before we embark on that, I guess we'll just take care of some general business, which is to say, please continue to patronize the Apple Podcast to give us ratings, etc.
And also, text an episode that you like, maybe this episode right here, to a friend. Just share it with them. That really helps us grow.
Indeed. Particularly this episode, because I feel that this episode functions as an hallucinogenic for people. If you have a friend that enjoys that kind of thing and always take it advisedly and taking, because I'm not going to lie. This gentleman it's like a contact high off of this guy.
You got a natural buzz off this conversation.
You get a natural buzz off of this conversation. I felt altered. I felt like I was.
You did, didn't you? Yeah.
Yes, I did. I felt like I was going to some other realm of existence entirely.
Why is it?
I don't know. I think it's that. I think it literally is a high. As I say, as we'll hear, there's something about sort of I get really, really jazzed touching the completely unknown and inexplicable. It really gives me a charge. It really makes me happy. And I don't know why. I don't know why, but it literally, whoa, baby. It is something else.
Now, we would never endorse this, but if you are a gentle listener, are the kind that do imbibe every now and then, well, this episode could be amplified by such behavior.
Could be right up your street. Just,
of course.
Yes, indeed. On to today's guest. It's amazing. He joins us from London on the Chinwag. I am really tickled to be meeting this guy in the flesh because I've known who he is and I've communicated with him over the years. He's the news editor of Fortean Times, the world's leading magazine for weird news, which has just celebrated its 50th anniversary. Now, that is something.
Yeah, it is. It really is.
That a weird-ass magazine like this can last 5 decades is something. It's like it's outlasted Time magazine at this point, which has been around longer, but it's survived longer. I don't know what that says about anything, but it has. It's survived. He has written for the magazine for over 30 years on subjects ranging from Aleister Crowley's cocktail recipes to robot wasps. He's edited Fortean Studies. He's written several compilations of Fortean Times stories, including one acclaimed by The Guardian as, quote, the toilet book of the year, unquote.
Masterful.
No, unbelievable. This is extremely exciting. I can't wait to talk to this guy. Can't wait to meet him. Please welcome Mr. Ian Simmons to the Chinwag. Hi, Ian. How are you?
I'm good. Welcome to Fortean Towers.
Oh, is this the actual Fortean Towers that I'm seeing?
Yes, well, it's my office at home, so yeah, there you go.
Holy cow. This is a treat for me because I'm seeing into the inner sanctum. I'm seeing into the heart of the Fortean Times. I just have to say right off the bat that I have been a loyal reader of that magazine for 35 years. And I don't think I have not missed an issue of that magazine. I subscribe to it now, but it used to be a real excursion every month to go find it somewhere. There were newsstands where I knew in New York I could find it, but sometimes I'd be in other countries and I'd still manage to find it because I had to get my fix every month. Now it gets sent to me, so it's easy for me to get my fix. But it's a tremendous magazine. I thank you for it. If nothing else, I get to thank you for letting me read this amazing magazine. Steve and I consider it a kind of guiding spirit in some ways, and Charles Fort a sort of presiding spirit of this podcast.
Absolutely, yes. He's very important. And we try and do our best to bring all the world's weirdness into people's front rooms. And yeah, it is easier these days to find it. I mean, I started reading it back in the day when it was described charitably as a sporadical.
Sporadical.
When it was kind of a little thing that mainly Bob Rickard and Paul Sivking were putting together in pre-digital days as part of the sort of British small press scene back in the 70s. I first discovered it in the early 80s, and and you kind of had to find it in strange places. A
friend of mine was a guy that I know who lived in London in the 70s. I mentioned this to him and he said, "Oh yeah, I used to see that around sort of hand stapled. It was sort of stapled together and it was kind of Xerox and
in the zine days."
Yeah, which is so fantastic. I'm sorry I missed it then, but I got onto it sort of 1989, I think is when I somebody turned me onto it when I lived out in Seattle.
I should just say, Ian, that our listeners are very smart and many of them will know what Fortean means, but it would be helpful if you sort of gave a thumbnail sketch of who Charles Fort was. And really, I think that would help listeners just so that everything that follows will sort of build on that.
And maybe they'll understand what the hell Steve and I are on about, because it's like, you know, yeah.
Well, Charles Fort was a New Yorker. He was born in Albany, and he was active writing about the kind of stuff that we're talking about from about sort of properly from about 1919 till the early 30s, although he'd gone through several iterations before that. He'd been a newspaper man and short story writer, and was a failed novelist. And somewhere along the lines of writing one of his novels, he'd kind of discovered press clippings about weird shit. And
an archive man.
Yeah, absolutely. Turned his life over to those. So New York Public Library, and then for some years he moved to London, lived in Marchmont Street, and went to the British Museum and waded through things there, and compiled 4 extraordinary books: The Book of the Damned, Lo, New Lands, and Wild Talents, which had all these stories put together with a completely unique style. He kind of believed all of them and believed none of them at the same time. But he rescued these things that he described as damned data. I have, let's see, I have a couple of quotes from Fort here, which are worth reading out. This one comes from Book of the Damned, which is his first one. And I guess this is right at the beginning of the book and sets out his manifesto, which is: a procession of the damned. By the damned, I mean the excluded. We shall have a procession of data that science has excluded. Battalions of the accursed, captained by pallid data that I have exhumed, will march. You'll read them, or they'll march. Some of them livid, and some of them fiery, and some of them rotten. Some of them are corpses, skeletons, mummies twitching, tottering, animated by companions that have been damned alive. There are giants that will walk though sound asleep. There are things that are theorems and things that are rags. They'll go by, like you could, arm in arm, with the spirit of anarchy. Here and there will foot little harlots. Many are clowns, but many are of the highest respectability. Some are assassins. There are pale stenches and gaunt superstitions, and mere shadows and lively malices, whims and amiability, the naive and the pedantic and the bizarre and the grotesque, and the sincere and the insincere, the profound and the puerile. A stab and a laugh, and the patiently folded hands of hopeless propriety. The ultra-respectable, but the condemned anyway.
Amazing.
I love these quotes.
Yeah. No, they're really
really good flavor of.
The writing style is great.
It's fantastic.
This one was a great favorite of our late great Fortean friend, the actor Ken Campbell, who was possibly the funniest man ever to live. Present company excluded.
Yeah. Oh, no.
And amazing monologue, and a person who was at the bottom of a lot of sort of trickster weirdness in British culture.
Interesting. Yeah.
But he used to use this as his sort of vocal warm-up for going on stage. And
excellent.
He apparently discovered Fort, having heard about him from years, after putting his foot through a box of Fortean books whilst trying to climb to a higher shelf in a bookshop in Newfoundland. Anyway, a naked man in a city street, the track of a horse in volcanic mud, the mystery of reindeer's ears, a huge black form like a whale in the sky, and it drips red drops as if attacked by celestial swordfishes. An appalling cherub appears in the sea. Confusions! Showers of frogs and blizzards of snails, gushes of periwinkles down from the sky. The preposterous, the grotesque, the incredible. And why, if I am going to tell you hundreds of these, is the quite ordinary so regarded.
Amazing. That's awesome. Fantastic. Was you say an interesting thing, because he was sort of an independently wealthy man, right? Wasn't he was just how he could sort of manage to do this with his life, sort of gather these things?
Yeah, he was in a way independently wealthy, but he didn't actually have much money. He only achieved being independently wealthy partly by living incredibly frugally, and partly because his wife would go out and work as a washerwoman and things.
Oh,
okay.
And
they living on the back of his wife.
Yep.
Yeah, they had very little money, even so, and lived very frugally as a result. But he did have a little bit of money from the family, which kind of made the difference between him having to work and sitting in the library looking up incredible weirdness.
But here's what I think is so interesting. And listening to you do that, both of them, and you're doing it beautifully, by the way.
Very nice, yeah.
And really nice, very nice. And you're saying Ken Campbell, who is this great sort of, and this kind of trickster figure. It's so interesting to me. He's a bit of a kind of showman, Fort. He's a bit of a kind of trickster, showman. He's a bit of a clown. He's a bit of a performer, but there's a serious intent to it as well, right? I mean, talk about that a little bit. It's like, because he is putting us on a little bit, but he's also seriously going after something too, right?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, he's talking about damn data, which is stuff. I mean, he's often described as a sort of opponent of science, which is absolutely not the truth. He tries to go for stuff that has got good scientific documentation, or at least good, attested
corroboration or whatever.
Somewhere. But his thing is that conventional society then filters this, and there's a whole bunch of stuff which seems to be as equally well attested as the stuff that we accept as everyday reality, and yet gets pushed out and ignored, and kind of we don't deal with that because it completely wrecks our consensus reality. And he's very serious about that, but he kind of he slides a bit into the sort of ranty obsessive in new lands, but I think he realizes that and pulls back for the last two books.
So it's a fine line for him. For he himself, he had a fine line between being a crank and a sort of like serious philosopher. Interesting.
I'm sort of a fan of this era a little bit, because I think what listeners would appreciate is that there was a kind of scientific status quo that was called positivism. And it sort of comes from the 19th century, but it got very strong like in Vienna in the 20s and before that. And it seems like, in a way, people like Charles Fort and before him, maybe William James, they're trying to say, look, you've got too narrow a view of science, and we need to sort of put a foot in the door or wedge our way in here so that science will stay open-minded. This is how I'm reading him. Like, it's almost like it's like an attempt, because the positivist said, look, if you can't do an experiment right here and verify what you're saying, then you have to throw it on the rubbish heap and just say that's all garbage. But then along comes, I think, Fort and says there's all these weird mysteries. Like when I read Data of the Dam, he says the frogs raining out of the sky and like sort of manna or tissues falling out of the heavens. Like maybe you could tell us about some of the examples that he talks about so that listeners would get a sense of the original weirdness.
I mean, he's got all sorts of things. I mean, there are rains of blood. There are rains of fish. Rains of blood, yes. I particularly like his rains of blood. One of the things that I think was at the root of my fascination with all this stuff was it rained frogs on my father in India during the war when he was stationed out there with the RAF. Yes, I have some sort of. I've never really experienced anything sort of strange, wonderful, and Fortean directly myself. I don't.
Oh, really?
Maybe once a famous poltergeist, but I'm never sure whether somebody was having me on.
What famous poltergeist did you perhaps experience?
I was brought up in Croydon in South London, and there was a bar called the King's Cellars, which was slightly anomalous for Pulse in several ways. One, it was modern. It dated from the 70s. It was under a tower block. Two, it lasted a very long time. And three, it didn't seem to have a human focus, but it was very, very well known for being quite a destructive poltergeist. That would flare up, and there was supposed to be also a ghostly woman in there as well, roughly contemporary with the bar, in fact. And I was drinking in there once, and there was a crash behind the bar, and something had fallen off one of the shelves, and the barman went, it's the ghost again. I don't know. I wasn't paying attention, so I don't know whether he just dropped something. It was
fascinating.
Big smart, or whether it was the thing. But yeah, my father had weird experiences, and my mother had a whole shed load of stuff. She seemed to be quite psychic, but also had ball lightning float into her house when she was a teenager. So
really,
yeah, and they tell these stories, and you go, ooh.
Wow. And ball lightning really is a thing, right?
And is there what's the explanation? Is there any explanation for ball lightning?
It appears to be some sort of plasma, the fourth state of matter, that relates to charged dust, possibly. Nobody's quite sure how it starts or quite, but there was an atmospheric scientist in, I think, the 80s filmed some ball lightning floating down the aisle of an aircraft he was on.
Oh, really?
Whoa.
And that kind of became a bit difficult for anybody to go, nah, it's not a thing, because a serious scientist in the kind of field that this phenomenon existed had filmed the damn thing, so bang on in all possible ways. And so it kind of all sorts of, it's one of the things with this damned phenomena that us Forteans poke about it is, as soon as it becomes kind of respectable, people always forget that it was weird shit to start with. And then
that's interesting.
The cryptids too.
Yeah. I mean, back in the day, giant squid were kind of mythic, weird creatures, and now there's one in formaldehyde in the basement of the Natural History Museum. Have you ever read China Miéville's book Kraken?
I have not, and I really want to read that book. Is it good? Is it worth reading? I mean, I think everything that guy wrote is worth reading, but is it good?
Really got to read that. It's it's about somebody about weird cultists impossibly stealing the giant squid from the basement of the Natural History Museum.
He's a fantastic writer, China.
I've not read it.
He's really great. One of his best books is called The City in the City, which is about these coexistent cities that if you train yourself, you won't see one reality from the other, but then some people it starts to bleed over. It's a fantastic book, but I've always wanted to read that.
There was a good TV series of that as well.
Oh, did they do that? Oh, did they really do this? Oh, yes.
Yeah, it was done very well.
Well, the Fortean Times has a whole column on cryptozoology, right? I mean, that Paul was telling me that's a feature of every issue almost.
Yeah, Carl Schuker, who's a very experienced cryptozoologist, writes something about the latest in the field most months.
If you see something like a giant squid and it was a cryptid, but then it becomes a real animal, and that's sort of a common thing like that. I know that's true of the kangaroo and the
gorillas.
Orangutan.
Yeah, gorillas, right.
Gorillas, that's right.
Okapis.
Do you think that that's going to be true do Forteans think that that's going to be true of like raining frogs and, some of the other unexplainable things, that they will eventually come under the umbrella of the sciences, or they will always remain damned data?
I mean, some of the things are gradually sliding into the, the respectable. I mean, Paul Cropper and Sharon Hill, in a few issues back in FT, were pretty much cracking the rain of fish thing with some fairly serious research which involved vomiting pelicans and things, which I think pins that down.
Oh, is that right? Really? That's what it really is.
Yes.
Fantastic.
And so that's kind of sliding into there. Some things, though, are just going to remain howlingly batshit. Partly because they are. That's a sort of professional term. Howlingly batshit.
Howlingly batshit.
Howlingly batshit.
I do have a jar of Bigfoot shit over there, but
do you really?
Yeah,
do you really? Yeah. Can we see it?
Yeah, I'll find the Bigfoot shit.
No, I'm okay. Well, while Ian goes to get the Bigfoot shit, just a reminder:
Paul,
you're listening to Chinwag.
Just a reminder.
Just a reminder. You're listening to Chinwag, and here he is with the Bigfoot shit.
Oh yeah, it's quite desiccated.
It sure is fossilized. It's petrified.
Yeah, it's
what's the provenance of what's the provenance of this Bigfoot shit? Where did you get it? And is there any reality to it?
I did an exhibition called Monsters and Miracles at Croydon Clock Tower Museum in 1995, where I collected material evidence for Fortean phenomena from all sorts of places. So I had a rat king from Göttingen Museum. I had apports from the Enfield Poltergeist, all sorts of wonderful things. I had the fairy coffins from Edinburgh museums, and various people got wind of this and sent me things. And I forget who it was now, but one of the US cryptozoologists sent me Bigfoot shit.
Wow, great.
My background's in biological sciences. I did a degree in that, and I worked in science museums for 30 odd years before I attempted to retire, and then got scooped up by FT to to be news editor, having contributed for many years whilst I was working at something else. So unfortunately, I think this is basically an owl pellet, but hey,
It looks convincing to me, man.
Now, here's a question, though, that I have. Are Forteans concerned with the explanation? Are Forteans, that's skeptics, though, isn't it, in some ways? Isn't that more the skeptics? What is it? Because I always feel like what's joyous about being a Fortean is just saying, here's the weird shit. You go ahead and try and figure it out. You go ahead and try and dismantle it. I'm just going to enjoy the weirdness of this thing. Is that right?
Yeah, to a certain extent. The thing is you find that there's on one end, there's the people who just believe and, really resistant to explanation. And on the other end, there's the guys who just don't believe and are completely resistant to any strangeness. You sort of sit in the middle, but like a tennis umpire going,
that's what I like. I like it.
As they whack the argument to and fro. If a convincing explanation turns up and it looks like it really does work, we'll go, yeah, that looks about right.
Yes, that seems right. Yeah.
Yeah, if a stupid explanation is put forward by, respectable people, you go, nah, that's no. You're just trading on your reputation to try and damn things.
But there's some humor, too. Like you said, the trickster, and then the people that are into it have a sense of humor about it, too. That's really refreshing.
There is a sense of strangeness and humor and joy in the weirdness of things. I always think of it, as I say, I'm a scientist, but I'm also very fond of the trickster. I'm very fond of surrealism. I kind of think it's the sort of bit where science and surrealism meet. It's kind of where reality goes fuzzy at the edges.
Yeah. Pataphysics.
Pataphysics, right.
If you think about the bell curve, that sort of statistical thing where you have a big bulge in the middle and then a long tail of things going out to the end, where the most common things are the things that are found right in the middle, and the least common are the things that trail out way onto the long tails, where they do happen, but vanishingly rarely. What we do is the long tail. We're way out on the fringe there.
There's some people, somebody I think of like Jacques Vallee and people like that, for whom the phenomenon themselves are almost kinds of trickster. It's almost something that's tricking us. The UFOs, the aliens, the fairies, the Bigfoot, they themselves are kind of tricking us in some way. Is that right?
Yeah.
Is that a fair thing to say about some of the point of view on it?
Yeah, the phenomena itself plays games.
Yeah.
There is no doubt about that.
Interesting.
And there's a number of things that sort of come off from that. One is, I suspect that we haven't got a complete grasp on reality by any means. Secondly, a lot of this is epiphenomena of consciousness.
And what do you mean by that?
Something that's sort of a side effect of consciousness. It can range from it being just our perceptions doing strange things to the whole idea that consciousness is not what we think it is. There's an increasing suspicion. I mean, New Scientist had an article about it, the British sort of Science Weekly recently, about the idea that consciousness might not actually be a brain thing, that it can be a sort of fundamental force of reality, and everything to a certain extent has consciousness, every object to a degree, and it might.
Is that panpsychism? Is that what they call?
Yeah, panpsychism.
Yeah, right. Everything dips into consciousness. It's almost some entity outside of ourselves that enters us, or we dip into it. Is that what that is, or is it?
There's an idea. You mentioned Henry James. It might be one of his.
Yeah.
That our brain is actually a filter. It doesn't generate consciousness. It filters it.
Yeah. James said that the reality is a blooming, buzzing confusion, and so consciousness is like a filter, so that you can handle it. And also, like you were saying, like more recent research suggests that the mind is creating a reality that's kind of like a giant hallucination anyway. So that's what the Forteans have been on about for a long time.
Yeah. So the tail end of the experience of this is where the weird shit that we deal with lives. And also there's the idea that one of the things that comes out of the Fortean is it's all connected, all this strangeness. When I did that exhibition I mentioned, I had to draw a diagram that explained how everything connected. It was kind of this spidery thing with fairies connecting to Bigfoot, connecting to aliens.
It's all connected.
It's totally because you will always find stories that connect them in all sorts of weird ways, and people silo things. But if you look at the phenomena from a Fortean point of view, sometimes it looks like it's all the same thing because it behaves in the same way. I mean, you look at the kind of entities that people get in seances. You look at the ones that they get in poltergeist cases. You look at fairies. You look at people who are channeling aliens. You look at things that come through in Ouija boards. They're all kind of similar.
That's interesting.
They are not the sharpest tools in the box. They are quite malevolent. They lie and they play games. The number of poltergeists and things like that who the Ouija board entities that turn up. Oh, I'm the devil. No, you're not.
You're a low-level miscreant of some kind.
Yeah, it's they're basically like a slightly dim, foul-minded, malevolent 11-year-old.
I'm going to ask you about a specific thing because I just want our listeners to hear it and talk, because you're saying poltergeist. What can you just briefly tell me about Jeff the Talking Mongoose?
Oh, Jeff. We love Jeff.
I know we love Jeff. I love Jeff. But I don't know that people know. And I've been wanting to bring Jeff the Talking Mongoose up a lot. But can you just give us a kind of quick thumbnail sketch of it and we can discuss it? But I'm interested, please.
First of all, there's recently been a film made
really?
About Jeff. It's terrible. Don't watch it.
What are the odds of the Jeff the Talking Mongoose movie being bad? Oh well, okay.
And but the best book is a book called Jeff by a guy called Chris Joseph, who was my predecessor.
I have that book. I will say that I have that book.
Yeah. So if people want to go into it more, that's the route. But Jeff is He's a unique entity. There's never been anything quite like Jeff. It's spelled G-E-F. And for years, most people thought it was Geff. But kind of assume it's Geff. No, it's Jeff. It's just that the people who named him were not great at spelling, and it's Jeff as in the guy's name, Geoff or Jeff.
Right.
But they spelt it Geff.
That's right.
That kind of adds to it. I mean, if it become Dave or Derek or something or Norman, it would quite have the same resonance.
No.
Anyway.
No.
In the 1930s, on the Isle of Man, the Irving family, there's a husband and wife and their daughter, Voiri, are living on an isolated farm. There's all sorts of stuff in their background, which means they're quite unhappy and slightly disturbed. This farm is a tip, and they're not being very successful. And they start getting poltergeist phenomena. And then they get the poltergeist sort of, as poltergeist phenomena do, they start to develop. And eventually it starts talking to them. And it claims to be an entity called Jeff, who's a very clever mongoose from India. And he does various things around the house, and he catches rabbits and stuff. And eventually they get to start to see him. And he's like a weaselly thing. He's got a big fluffy tail, which mongooses don't. And strangely enough, little human hands.
Oh my God. That sounds...
I'm pretty certain that H.P. Lovecraft knew about this. And
yes.
Brown Jenkin, who turns up in one of his stories as a sort of furry thing with little human hands, is a Jeff derivative. But he sort of continues for quite a few years, and there's all sorts of odd things go on. Nandon Fodor and Harry Price, various psychic investigators, go and investigate, and he kind of won't talk to them. Fodor gives Voiri a camera. She takes some blurry photographs, which may or may not be a first stole draped over a fence, but and he can kind of do odd things, like, as I say, he talks, and he also goes,
which is already unusual for a poltergeist, right? The talking, or is that something?
He's quite chatty. I mean, polts do talk. Sometimes, and sometimes through people, as in the
through people. Yeah.
This one doesn't. He's supposed to talk, but there are hints, if you look at the story closely, that maybe he isn't exactly talking. Mr. Irving is quite into this whole thing, and he chats with Jeff a lot. But if you read between the lines, and there's only one or two other people who kind of claim to have heard him speak, but it's not quite sure. It may be that Mr. Irving is listening to sounds, and it might be that he's kind of interpreting it. He's kind of saying, "Oh, Jeff is saying," and it tends to be him who's hearing Jeff say things. And it's kind of like, he may be sort of really expanding this, and it's partly him.
He could be hearing water going through the pipes and the or something like that, and he's interpreting them as sounds or something like that. He's hearing things that very interesting.
I think there's very little doubt that at the base of this there was, a classic poltergeist phenomenon of knockings and throwings and, noises and stuff, all the canonical things of poltergeist phenomena. And then there's a sort of foliatoire between the family who are kind of telling a story on top of it. And they get attention, kind of an interesting attention, which is something that you get the sense that they were craving. And so Jeff gets spun up out of this into this amazingly strange entity, which is fascinating and wonderful in its own right.
Super fascinating. And how does it end? Does it just one day Jeff is just gone, or what happens?
It kind of just fades out. By the beginning of the war, Jeff's basically vanished. But somebody claims to have shot him years later.
The mongoose? The talking mongoose?
I have to say, though, that one of the best things in the book, and it is a great book, and I do have the book, and I've read the book, but one of my favorite parts of the book is a very granular discussion about whether Jeff was in fact a mongoose, a ferret, or a stoat. I think there's a lot of questions. And it gets into some very, very granular stuff that it's really fantastic. It's really, really great.
What you were describing, Ian, is a perfect example of the sort of phenomenon where there's an event that's happening, sounds, and then, like you were saying, it gets sort of spun up by the imagination and by the social group, and then also it draws attention, and so there's a social force that's reinforcing this kind of attention. It happens a lot in many of these phenomena,
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think there's some that resist this explanation too. Like, and I'm wondering one of the things that Fort said in the Book of the Damned was, this seemed really prescient to me. He said, people have seen demons for a long time, but what if those are actually, aliens or extraterrestrials? He says this at one point. And this is something that then, like you were saying, Paul, Jacques Vallee comes along much later and makes a similar point. Doesn't he say something like this? Like, angels, demons,
fairies, they're all sort of different manifestations of the same thing. Are there aliens? Or
I mean, there's a whole sort of trend these days to sort of big up demons. They're becoming much more prominent, partly from...
Are they? Demons are on the rise?
Demons.
I mean, there's one of the things about the very strange bubble that is US ufology, which really has no connection to ufology in the rest of the world in many ways, and it's kind of devolved into a weird thing where instead of actually going out and hunting saucers, you're writing impassioned letters to your congressman, saying, please tell us everything you know, but you know everything. And no, I don't think they do. But one of the weird things about it is that some of the people in the US military are convinced that are apparently discouraging investigation to any of this on account of it being demons, because they're heavily influenced by the evangelical right.
I had not heard that. Wow.
I hadn't either.
I did get a very weird story via one of my connections about something to do with special forces somewhere, possibly in Mexico, having serious run-ins with werewolves and coming off very badly, and this being a major concern of certain quarters of the defense establishment. I tried to follow it up and it kind of evaporated weirdly, but it's such a good story.
Yeah.
You may have seen it in the last issue of FT. I don't know whether it's reached you yet, 444. There's a whole thing about goblins in Zimbabwe.
What's happening with the goblins in Zimbabwe?
Well, there is some very... I picked this up because there was a very serious sort of outbreak, which is...
I like the lingo, a Polt outbreak. That's awesome.
In which this family were getting the classic poltergeist thing, where there was a family with children aged 13, 12, and 8. The story begins. It started last November. One morning, our children woke up with their heads shaved.
Oh, that kind of thing.
Wow.
Well, yeah.
That sounds like such a sort of classic, like, kind of 19th century fairy story or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
that it's the brownies cut my hair in the night because I didn't leave them cookies out, or I didn't leave them cheese or something. So they cut my hair. It's the same.
Yeah, and then it expands into doors and windows opening, children's clothes being torn, fires, stones appearing out of nowhere, invisible people cooking in the kitchen, vanishing pots and pans. Whenever they get somebody, a spiritual healer or anybody in to try and deal with things, it gets worse. They send the children to their grandmother in South Africa, and the phenomenon follows them. Then eventually part of the house burns down. And so I started looking into this, and I went back to the original sources in Zimbabwe and found pages and pages of stories about goblins, because this was attributed to goblins.
Not witches.
No. Well, witches who own goblins and have probably acquired them to generate money, and then lost control of them. There's a 6-year-old child who was beaten to death by an invisible entity with a brick. The brick's invisible as well. There's a primary school attacked by goblins, with children being slapped by invisible hands, and weird snakes in the toilet. And just sort of a whole load of them. There's one which sounds like a social panic thing, in which children were convulsed and choked by unknown creatures, making them weak and unable to walk, and won't go to school and things like that, and miss their exams. teachers who flee a school because the women teachers keep waking up in the middle of the night and find that they've been dressed in men's trousers, whilst the male teachers keep going into trances and seeing visions of a deceased colleague's shoes.
Wow. Super strange. Very strange.
You know, it is really going. But the interesting thing with the Poltergeist is it's exactly the same as the kind of thing that happened with Jeff, happened in happened in Enfield, happened in back into the 17th century, the Cock Lane, or 18th century, the Cock Lane ghost in London. They all do the same thing, which is, if you look at, again, ufology, you'll find that ufology reinvents itself about every 10 to 15 years with a completely new mythology, completely new set of influencers, and pretends it's always been the same. And you can pick up the sort of cultural pivot points that have fed the changes. But if you look at poltergeists, they just keep polting on in exactly the same way.
That's interesting.
You know, you can have a big film like Poltergeist in the 80s, which seriously misrepresents the phenomena. If that was UFOs, you look at Independence Day and ET and things like that, and you can see how they feed into the mythology. The film Poltergeist hardly fed in at all. You know, it just,
is that right?
Pulse just went, whatever, and just continued doing things.
No, well, I'm always on about this, which is that, like, what happened to the sort of the classic gray aliens? They've been gone for a long time, and then it was sort of lizard people have sort of, there's the lizards and stuff like that. But is that still sustaining, or is that changing into demons now or something? Is that sort of like
demons are becoming more popular. The reptoids, which are very clearly driven by David Icke's shape-shifting royals, whereas the greys, whereas the greys came from the Whitley Strieber via
Communion,
Betty and Barney Hill. The greys manifested because when Whitley Strieber's Communion came out, certainly over here, all the bus shelters had big posters of a grey alien face from the book cover advertising it.
Same here.
Yeah. So everybody got this, this is what an alien looks like thing. And suddenly, hey, they're all greys, you know. And
everybody's seeing that. Yeah.
There's a story about cultural evolution here that not in some grand scheme of like over millions of years, but just over decades, like you said, you could really get a meme to spread lightning fast. Like even before the internet, those communion images of the greys, everybody got that in their head. Now, what about today with the internet? It must be like, are people more predisposed to believe in wacky weirdness, or are they more skeptical, or is it both?
It's both. I mean, but more the former than the latter. There's a lot, I mean, you've seen these things like Slender Man, and recently there's been a bit in the news about a girl who has been trying to be released from prison after spending several years there, having been locked up at about the age of 12 when she and her friends stabbed to another girl to death. I think she might have actually survived, but anyway, was
right here, in Wisconsin. The Slender Man case,
was and Slender Man was purely a meme that was invented in a creepypasta photo competition, and has taken on a life of his own, and people are sacrificing things to him, and this is what happens. Stuff takes on strange life.
I was just thinking, do you ever get nervous that you're also putting stuff out there that, like, maybe a less, how do I put this? Like a more credulous mind might act on, you know what I'm saying? Like, does it, when you put out like some of these memes and this crazy stuff, Slender Man, and then somebody goes and stabs somebody, do you have any responsibility that you put it out there? I mean, I'm not asking this well, but you follow
I know what you mean.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we're conscious of this sort of thing. And so, I mean, one of the important things with the way that we do it is that, there's that certain amount of distance that we have as Forteans. And when we're writing about, certainly when I'm writing about anything in the news pages, it's kind of, I will inject a a sort of healthy bit of skepticism into my writing about the more sort of dubious kind of items. But I know that there are people who just filter that straight out and go for the go for the crazy bits.
Oh, Steve, I need to catch my breath. I need to stop for a moment and catch my breath.
Is your head spinning?
My head is spinning, Steve. This is so much my happy place. It's actually, it's indecent. This is not good for me.
It's indecent.
Oh my God. I feel like I'm just having a weird dream. It's just a weird dream. You know what I mean?
Yeah, because this is so in your wheelhouse. Like each one of these things is like you could spend a whole year working on, and you're just hearing like one after another.
No, one after another. And I'm sitting here wanting to go like, yeah, but what about Spring-Heeled Jack? And what about, it's just like, oh my God, it's just insane. It's just endless. What the fuck? What the fuck,
so
Steve?
Much fun.
So much fun. So we thank you for being here, everybody, and joining and indulging me and indulging Ian and indulging Steve. But I think shortly, at some point soon, we're going to have a second episode of this.
We need to, yeah. There's more to come, and we definitely need to have another episode on this. So keep an eye out for that. It's going to be incredible.
It gets out to the outer edges of the known and the possible and the reasonable and the useful. It gets to the edge of all of that. So please be sure to check that out. And until then,
pretty
please.
soon, I think the government is going to start to want to look at our episodes to see if we're revealing any sort of conspiracy secrets. Yeah, like it's going to be a Men in Black situation.
The NSA. Oh yeah, that would be. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. Get the NSA on our tail. Oh my God. Well, here's a big shout out to the NSA. Guys at the NSA, wag on, guys.
Weirdos.
If you're listening.
Chinwag is a production of Treefort Media and Touchy Feely Films, hosted and executive produced by Paul Giamatti and Stephen Asma. Executive producers for Treefort are Kelly Garner and Lisa Ammerman. Dan Carey is executive producer for Touchy Feely. Our series producer is Rachel Whitley Bernstein. Original theme music by Luke Top, with additional music by Via Mardot. Oscar Guido is our executive in charge of production. Tom Monahan is head of audio for Treefort. Audio production supervision by Jared Brom and Matt Dyson. Editing and mixing by Jeff Neal. Animation created by Alex Sokol. Research assistance by Aidan Brooks. Lastly, for more information, go to chinwagpod.fm and find us on Instagram or TikTok at chinwagpod or on Twitter at chinwag_pod.